Therapy Geeks, a podcast by Luke McGibbon and Louise Taylor.
And then the dog jumped up on the jogger, and then that was what was. We didn't want that on the Long Beach.
That's a completely untrue story there, just to begin the podcast. Howdy, hello, listener. We're going to be taking a slightly more serious approach to the podcast today, simply because we're talking about a slightly more serious topic that affects, well, you know, it's the thing, isn't it? When it comes to mental health, it's the topic, and it's touched many people. It's touched my extended family. I'm not sure about yourself, Louise. Have you known anybody at all?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think most people know of somebody or know somebody, but yes, and I've supported people, a lot of people who've been impacted.
So in this episode, we're talking about suicide. So it's the big one. So to begin with, we have to talk about Emile Durkheim, who is he's French. I really should have read that before I checked. Emile Durkheim, yes, he was a French sociologist, of course. Sorry, you know, sometimes whenever you read somebody's book, but you don't actually know a thing about the single person. But Emile Durkheim literally wrote the book on suicide in 1897. So it was the first big methodological study of it, and he found a few things which I'm not so sure are completely relevant now, but then some other things that are still relevant now. You know, depressingly, in so many mental health topics, there's so many problems with certain things that are just ageless. So we'll talk about some of his findings here. Suicide rates are higher in certain demographics. Would you have any in mind, Louise, whenever you hear like suicide? Who comes to mind for you?
Well, there's two professions that I heard that are quite high rates, surprisingly. Dentists,
wow. Okay, I
yeah,
didn't know about that.
And farmers.
Dentists and now farmers, that makes a lot of sense to me, you know, because currently, you know, as you know, I'm working on a suicide hotline, and you know, some of those night shifts are like 10:30 p.m., 6:30 a.m., and you know, between the hours of like 3 to 5, sometimes you get nearly nobody, and then about 5 or 6, that's when you get the farmers, you know, and it's, to me, it makes sense because there's a tremendous amount of loneliness there, and we'll probably be talking about this sort of impact of loneliness on suicide rates later, actually. But so dentists, though, that one surprises me. Why's that, do you think?
Well, artificial light, lots of chemicals. Like, would you want to spend your day it's like, I think it's a lot of hard work on the settings. Very, like, I know that lots of jobs are really hard, but I don't know. I think there might be something about, it might be quite, I can't imagine wanting to do it. It's paid quite well.
Yeah.
And it's often associated. I remember whenever my siblings were doing medicine, they always talked about dentists being wannabe doctors. So kind of like,
well, there's a lot of wannabe doctors about, including ourselves, probably.
I don't want to be I'm sure I grew up in that. My father's GP. I never understood why people want to do that. Like, do you know what I mean? But the prestige, I suppose it's prestigious, and in some ways and well paid. But dentists, I don't know. There's something.
Gosh, yeah.
I don't know.
And, you know, I think it makes a lot of sense what you're saying about the artificial light and chemicals, because that wouldn't have even been something I'd have taken into consideration. I suppose just off the top of my head, like, I'm wondering if maybe the posture. I mean, you know, because we've discussed it lightly before. We should probably do a whole episode on it, but the importance of the body when it comes to, you know, modern psychotherapy and wellness is it's much more paramount than previously thought. And when I think, you know, you spend most of your days hunched over, like there was a study a bunch of years ago about how, you know, working in an office was as bad for your body as cigarettes, you know, because of all that hunching. And I don't know, maybe that's some part of it, but I am genuinely just taking a shot in the dark there. But okay, yeah. Well, Durkheim there, he found the suicide rates are higher, obviously in men more than women. That's something that's still true now. though Durkheim's study found that married women who remained childless for a number of years ended up with a high suicide rate. And yeah, that's something that's often spoken about now. Often, whenever people mention patriarchy, that's one of the points that's sort of raised against it. You know, people say, well, how can there be a patriarchy when men's suicide rates are so high? And then, you know, the common answer for that is always that, well, you know, men aren't encouraged to talk about their feelings. And I think that's a really vague thing, isn't it? Like, I think there's much more to it than that. What do you think?
Well, I think the rates of mental health are much higher in women, but I think women, I'd say if you were to, like, you talk about, I think a lot of women attempt but aren't successful. I think men are a lot more successful when they at completing or dying by suicide, whereas I think in terms of suicide attempts, I think there's large numbers of suicide attempts that have been unsuccessful with females, but there are higher, the percentage of mental health is much stronger or higher in women. But the suicide, it's the finality, it's the way that men complete suicide often is like you will hear it much more often with the families of men bereaved, like they had no idea. They had no idea. They didn't see it coming. It was a complete shock. And then if you think of some of the ways that they do, this is like, I think this is a lot about social conditioning and expectations on men and women. And it seems sometimes with men, and even if you think of other situations where things just, it's like something just breaks, something just clicks, and then there's often no lead up to it.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, because I think that is one of the things when people say about men not talking about their feelings is it leads to men not having a total awareness of their own feelings. And, you know, I think of myself as a big wet liberal, you know, with a big soppy man heart. But, you know, whenever I get angry about something, sometimes it takes me a few days to realize that I'm angry about something. Do you know what I mean? And so, like, and I tell you what, it's a pain in the arse for my partner because, you know, I do make a point of raising things rather than letting them stew, you know, and sometimes I have to go, here, the way he spoke to me 2 days ago was actually really unhelpful and actually horrible and blah, 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 blah. And then we have to have this like delayed argument, you know, which is a thing. I think there's a lot to what you're saying about conditioning for men, because I do think that's the answer, because, you know, there's the simplistic but true answer of men not being able to talk about their feelings or being encouraged to talk about those feelings, and primarily, you know, we're all culpable for that, but I think men in groups of men are pretty bad at encouraging that from each other. Like I think that, you know, just in my experience as a man, and particularly in my teens when it was at its worst, and probably when I felt the worst ever, I found that my friendship groups back then, it felt like we were all quietly competing with each other, you know, rather than a group of mates. Like, it felt like we all were friends, but we all wanted to be better than each other, and we all wanted to do that by subjugating the person next to you. There was a sense or a feeling that you could not recognize when your mates were improving at something or earnestly trying at something, and every attempt at vulnerability was met with like loneliness, you know, like we all had attempts at vulnerability. If I remember times when people would say, do you guys ever feel like, you know, like XYZ? And everyone would say no, and we all felt that because but we just felt completely in denial of ourselves and in denial of our own vulnerabilities. So we would pretend it wasn't there and make that person feel horrible for sharing anything, and all of us doing lasting damage on each other, I imagine. I even remember, like, yeah, it just horrible stuff. I had, you know, best friends who I, you know, if I looked at it now, I was like, oh, we hated each other because, you know, it would be constantly, he'd be acting like he wanted to take things from my life and he felt like he could at any time, even though he absolutely couldn't. And we were just sort of, there was an unconscious butting of heads all the time, really unhealthy stuff. So I do think the element of competitiveness among friends can be really harmful, because as Scatman John once sung, everyone's free to compete as he chooses, but how can someone win if winning means that someone loses, you know? Which I grant you, you know, the 1998 single Scatman's World is not what you should be basing your life philosophy on, but you know, for a guy with a dodgy mustache and a little hat, he got a lot of things right. Am I talking out my own?
No, but I would like to say that if anybody, any of our listeners, any of our like long-term listeners, they'll be aware that that is not the first time you've referenced Scatman John.
Is it not? I
No.
bet it was the same fucking lyric too. I swear to God. Yeah, of course it. Of course it was. Can you tell I've listened to fucking 2 Scatman John songs? I'm afraid to say,
but they went deep. It went deep though. Look.
Well, it did. It did. I think, like, to talk about the conditioning of masculinity, right? With women, there's it's not quite, you know, it's not quite there yet, because there's still plenty of resistance from all corners, but there's plenty of movement within women in society to expand the definition of femininity, and that's a good thing, you know. And I'm not necessarily even just talking about the trans movement or the LGBT movement, but also to that, you know, that femininity can be different things, you know. Well, even off the top of my head, like Ronda Rousey, you know, the MMA fighter, is somebody now that is seen as very powerful, but also very feminine at the same time. And so they, you know, I mean, 20 years ago rather than 10 years ago, I think it would have been much harder for Ronda Rousey to be seen that way, because, and that sounds ridiculous, but then you look at like episodes of like Friends from 2000 where Chandler's dad is a transvestite, and they talk about it like it's the weirdest thing in the world, you know. And so I don't think men have the equivalent of, and well, they do, but it's not being pushed enough to expand the definition of masculinity. When you think of masculinity, you still think of some old shit. Do you know what I mean? You still think of the fighting Irish guy with his big mustache and his knuckles held up like this and bare chested. You know, you think of people lifting weights and grunting, and like, you know, maybe masculinity could also be fucking Simon Amstell talking about how he resents his dad for healing, you know, like in his old age rather than when he was a parent. You know, that takes some balls to talk about. That takes some real guts, and you know, that's masculine. That's I mean, that should be seen as masculine. I guess what I'm saying is the definition of masculine isn't very flexible, and the definition of women, of femininity, is getting more flexible. And again, you know, traditionalists are always going to try and push that down, and frankly make the world a better place, or a worse place, by doing that. But like, they've certainly got a bit more room to maneuver. You know, and I think that there needs to be more of that, you know, in society. But yeah, so it's more than just talking about feelings. It's about vulnerability, openness, and also you being whatever kind of person you are shouldn't make you less of a man or a woman. You know, other people don't get to decide that for you. That really, yeah, you know, fuck that. Anyway, so that's my little theory behind higher male suicide rates.
Yeah, conditioning. It's a lot of.
Sorry, pardon me. I'm burping.
Sorry.
Oh, I don't know.
That's what you think of. But I think you're absolutely right. But I think that's why the non-binary and the gender fluidity conversations. Like, I identify as a woman, I identify as an eco-feminist, like a feminist, right? Uh-huh. But I identify that way because of a lot of my experiences. I've been discriminated against and I've been oppressed and suppressed because of my gender. Mm-hmm. But I would say that I believe that I'm a mixture of masculine and feminine. I'm Louise. I was born with, you know, I was assigned female at birth. And I love being a woman, but is it that much of a big deal? It's like I have masculine qualities and feminine qualities. And I think, what is this masculine and feminine, this binary thinking, this dualistic thinking? Because I think it really fails people, because I think a lot of what we do, or I don't know, I can't speak for you, but what I do is like, I go, right, what's going on? who are you? What do you want? But it's about who are they? Who are they above the noise? Who are they above the trauma? Who are they before the trauma happened? Before they were told what they should be, how they should behave.
Yes.
And for a lot of, for a lot of the families, who have this horrific grief, this grief by suicide, they often replay the last moments and what they would have said or what they could have said to have stopped it or to have done it. And I think a lot of what we know is that we have to stop asking people or saying to people, what is wrong with you? And start saying or asking, what happened to you?
Yes. Brilliant. I think we're on the same page there, definitely. Like because the suicide rate's always been higher among soldiers and civilians, and obviously that's PTSD, isn't it? Like it couldn't be anything else. And there's other factors that are thrown in that really. I just realized I skimmed over your point about gender binaries as well, and perhaps making the definition of man or woman more flexible could just do away with getting rid of that binary altogether. That it limits us, and it makes us feel bad for being alive sometimes,
Yes.
And it's really horrible. I'm seeing that higher among Protestants than Catholics and Jews. Keep in mind this is in the late 1800s, but I wonder if perhaps obviously in my work in the suicide hotline, I do hear people say that one of the things preventing them from committing suicide is their religion. And I think it's really horrible that in the Catholic religion they say if you commit suicide you go to hell. I can't imagine a logical godly scenario where that would be the case, but it really does stop some people, and that's not to say you should use guilt or fear to tempt someone out of committing suicide, just that perhaps in this specific religious instance it does do that. But oftentimes trying to guilt or shame or make someone afraid of committing suicide, it just even if it stops them from committing, even if it stops them from dying by suicide, then you're not helping them get out of the pain that puts them in the suicidal state in the first place. But yeah, so that's Durkheim. We should talk a little bit about something that just literally came up there now, which is that we as professionals and slowly as a society now are stopping using the phrase committed suicide.
Yeah, suicide or died by suicide, as you said. Committed suicide, I think I think a lot of that's to do with the insensitivity towards the pain that people were committed. I think the responsibility, I think now it's more the responsibility is solely put on the person, as opposed to where I think the responsibility should be put is a lot more on the outside factors and the lack of support and care, and the conditions where people no longer believe that they've no option. Yes. So the completed or died by suicide is a lot more sensitive to the outside factors and the external factors that have impacted people's lives to the extent where they feel there's no option but to die.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty much on the same page as you there. I think that's sort of the reason given in general. It's about responsibility, isn't it? Like, if to say that somebody committed suicide, it makes it sound like a crime, like there was some criminal intent or intent to harm others via doing that, and it's laden with unnecessary guilt and shame. It's certainly difficult. Yeah, we're using now completed suicide or died by suicide because suicide often can be a result of external conditions or mental illness, and that's not necessarily somebody's fault, so to speak. So there's quite a few things that we've covered already. There's one of the big things that I was looking at when I was looking for my notes on on this was the interpersonal theory of suicide by a fellow called Thomas Joyner. So really, really smart guy. He's done plenty of interviews. I would recommend you give him a wee YouTube. He's got a lot of interesting things to say about suicide. But yeah, the one of the big things that he's been pushing is that we need to stop pretending that the means of suicide is not important. So one of the big points he raised was that there was a bridge where people would often attempt to die by suicide from, and so they put up just higher fences. People couldn't do that anymore, and what they found was that suicide rates at all the nearest bridges around it did not rise. So that led to an overall drop. So I think there's this myth that if someone wants to do it, they're going to do it no matter what. And certainly they can be persistent, but sometimes simply removing the preferred means really makes quite a difference. On the helpline, sometimes I will say to somebody, maybe you want to move the sharp objects into a different room, or maybe you want to move the tablets into a different room. And that sounds silly, makes people feel safer, and the people around you perhaps may feel safer too, knowing that the attempt is ever so slightly more difficult. You have an extra few seconds to think. It makes all the difference, because the means is something so important. One of the books I read in preparation for today, a fellow called Edwin Schneiderman. It's a book called The Suicidal Mind, and it's 3 case studies on people who've attempted to die by suicide. One of whom survived, two of them survived, but one of them in particular who survived. She attempted self-immolation in her car, and she described how the method was important to her because she just sort of wanted to disappear. Those were her words, and she wanted to sort of she talks about wanting to have been swallowed up by the earth. And so when you think of that, well, what's your first association with those sentences, Louise? Whenever you hear that, I want to be swallowed up by the earth, I just want to disappear.
Just sorrow, just a deep, deep pain.
Yes.
And I just feel like how broken are our societies where we have so many people feeling like this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we keep looking at the people, and we keep saying, take away the knives, or put up higher barriers on the bridges, or just take these, but we're not actually looking at the deep, deep inequalities, the soul destroying ways that we expect people. Like, society is so harsh for people who are different, who don't conform, or who can't fit in, or who can't play the game. And it's just, I just think when you hear about somebody wanting to be swallowed up by the earth, it's just like, you can go to therapy sessions. We keep sending people to therapy, and we keep medicating, and we keep pathologizing and medicalizing, but actually at some point we've got to say, instead of instead of pulling people out of the river, we've got to find out where they're jumping in.
Yes, I've heard that before. I think it's great, and I totally agree with you as well, that putting up higher barriers and restricting access to sharp objects and things like that, this is not a permanent solution, definitely. No. I suppose I'm just saying, in terms of like real high risk moments, like that's a way of getting some space, but it's certainly no like long-term solution. Otherwise you're going to end up with we'll dry out all the rivers and replace them with pillows, ridiculous stuff like that. But it's certainly a temporary solution. But I think, right, this client who wanted to disappear, who wanted to be swallowed up by the earth, what stood out to the author was that it was quiet. He believed that she wanted to die quietly, and so that's why she chose self-immolation, because she pictured it being quite quiet, maybe like a campfire or something like that. And she survived because it was very much not quiet. And obviously I won't go into detail, but it was in a car and things like that. So it was very much not quiet. It was not the way that she wanted to go, and so she left the car and was saved. And it says to me that like the means that people choose is so important. If you own a gun, simply by owning a gun, your chances of dying by suicide goes up like significantly. It's
that makes complete sense, doesn't it? Because it's a space. It's sometimes in those moments of heightened emotions or complete despair and pain where you're convinced there's no other option. Whereas if you have a gun, you've got like other people, they haven't got that option. So guns just don't make any sense to me, apart from for business purposes and for killing. That's Absolutely. Why they exist.
Yeah.
And that's what they do.
And I think, guns certainly appeal to people who want to die by suicide, and they want it to be quick and over and done, and they don't care about maybe necessarily quietness or falling asleep or anything like that. They just want to be certain and through it. And whenever I was a teenager, whenever I was having suicidal thoughts, that would be the way that I would picture it going. And luckily I just didn't live in a country where that happened, so yes. or where guns were accessible. I don't know if it would have happened or not. If I was, I like to think probably not, but you don't know. So in my head it was, if I'm still feeling this way whenever I'm like 19 or 20, I'll just buy a ticket to America and just sort myself out over there. But luckily by the time 19 and 20 came, there was some stability coming. So luckily I escaped myself.
But you see where like these public health issues and freedoms, like do you see, like, it's no surprise you have really upset, young, disenfranchised, it's alarming, but like whenever you're able to get hold of guns in very vulnerable times in your life, or you're having really hard emotional, it's no surprise that acts of deaths occur, because I just think that our governments are not committed to protecting life. Our governments are not protected to protecting the health of the population, or else they would be doing a hell of a lot more about these issues. That so many people. You're on mute. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it is important. Like, sorry, I was just moving room, but yeah, like the means it's important, and access, and that means if you can reduce that, then you do have an impact. But it's like you're saying, it's not actually going to reduce the real cause, which is pain. At the end of the day, psychological pain, something Schneiderman calls psych ache. We were having a sort of pre-recording discussion today, and we talked a little bit about a story that a police officer told you. Do you mind sharing it with me, and we'll discuss it?
Well, I want to, it was about empathy and understanding people, and how I think that it's hard to come from the perspective of somebody who is really ill and who wants to complete suicide if you're not there. And I think what happened was this officer did a really noble thing, like a brilliant thing, and saved a life. But the life that was saved didn't feel appreciative or didn't feel great about being saved, and actually made a complaint.
Yeah,
because their window was broken while their life was being saved.
Right.
And now the officers didn't understand. The officers, and I kind of was like, okay, I could hear they were upset, because that was really traumatic, going through the complaint. Also, seeing this person saving their life and then going through the complaint, it was like trauma. It was stressful. But I completely understood it from the perspective of the person who was ill and wanted to die.
Yeah.
My life was crap, and now my life is crap, and I have a broken window.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because I don't know if this is a common myth, but obviously these peelers were under the belief that the minute they're going to save this person is no longer going to be suicidal, and it's not the case. That suicide is the result of psychological pain. The quote from the book is, for what is suicide but an action to put an end to intolerable emotions. And to therapists like you and I, that seems like fairly obvious, but it's not always obvious even to the person experiencing that it's not simply that they just want to be dead, but they want something to be through. They want something to be over. They want something to be done.
They want the pain to go. I often think, and it was lovely the way that officer was recalling it to me, and I was very fond. Like, I could see the discomfort, and I wish I'd been able to go. But do you know what I thought? And I wish I'd said, I said, you see, that person will not feel grateful now, and they may never feel grateful. But if you years down the line, if they get better and if they fall in love, right, they're going to be like, I bloody love that police officer.
Yeah.
But not now. They can't experience gratitude or appreciation because it's horrific, whatever's going on. So I was thinking, like, expectation. We create our own expectations with we create our own disappointments through our expectations. But I do remember thinking, I wish I'd said that to the officer. I said, like, if they fall in love, they'll be grateful. Give them a bit of time. You know, if they something that, you know, but it's not now, not whenever they're. And I said that's a very sick person. Like, they're sick.
And that's the argument against euthanasia, as in a sense. Well, because I'm actually, you know, I'm a believer in euthanasia, but sometimes, you know, when I'm talking to someone who's suicidal, they'll frame it in that way. They'll say, you know, well, do you believe if someone's in incredible pain, they should be allowed to end their life? And you know, I think yes. I do think even in mental health, there are times when that does fall under that. But, you know, if there is the slightest chance of somebody being able to recover, then it shouldn't necessarily be it shouldn't be the number one option in that moment. You know, there's something that so it's like that person saved that peeler saved that person's life, and you know that's great, but it doesn't remove the psychic, like you're saying. It's not completely solved. So no. yeah, I think that's an important thing is in the book, you know, the Suicidal Mind. He says that one of the big things to look out for is a thing called constriction, and what that basically is well, you know, in CBT they call it all or nothing thinking. So basically that means that like it's the only option to them. So he describes this case study where he's talking to a young woman who's 19. She's become pregnant to somebody she did not want to become pregnant to, and she doesn't want to inform her mum, and she has decided that suicide is the only option. You know, it's like a tunnel vision thing. And he describes a process where he basically tried to sort of remove the blinkers. So he went through every option with her, and of course, you know, she had an answer for everyone. He said, you know, well, you could carry it to term and give it to adoption. She said, I don't want to do that. He said, you could have an abortion locally, and she said, I don't want to do that. And he said, well, you could travel outside of the city and get an abortion. And she said, I don't want to do that. He said, you could talk to the young man who was responsible for his pregnancy, and she said, I don't want to do that. And he was writing all these options down, even though she was saying, I don't want to do that. And he also wrote down suicide, and he handed her the piece of paper, and he said, like, could you rank these in order of most distasteful option to like most acceptable? And whenever she did that, she found that suicide wasn't necessarily the number one option there. The blinkers had been removed a little bit. She was able to see that there are other things that exist. So sometimes, like, you know, family and friends, sometimes it can feel like you're hitting your head off a brick wall suggesting options for people, and you know, you could still be having an impact. Though I would also say that, you know, the value of empathy over trying to throw solutions at people, because throwing solutions at people feels like you're telling them to fuck off, basically. And well, you know, maybe that's a bit of a harsher way to put it. Like, you know, if I tell you I'm feeling terrible and your first response is see a therapist, you know, that is a correct response rationally, but emotionally I'm hearing, don't come to me with that, come to a therapist, you know. So so constriction, that's one of the things to look out for.
I think people get scared, don't they? Like they get scared to hear or to see or to hear somebody's pain. So they go, oh no, I can't deal with that, go to a professional.
Yes.
And again, it comes back to the whole, like, we have decided that everything, a lot of things, right, if you need that, you go to them. If you need that, you go to them. If you need that, you go to them. And everything's become so compartmentalized in the way that we work, whereas a lot of us are unable to connect, like to just sit and connect with somebody, like, and have that connection. And I think I'd be like addiction, we were talking about, that is one form of, like, you could say, slow, long suicide.
Yeah, there's forms of indirect suicide. You know, you hear about some people who their relationship with food is possibly a form of indirect suicide, or, you know, smoking or drugs or alcohol or things like that. Not necessarily, you know, everyone who smokes or drinks or you know, diets obsessively, but for some people it's a certain manifestation of that, you know.
It's self-harm. Like, I'm guilty as charged here. Like, I've done a lot of these behaviors, like, it's but do people not say that, or is it not? I've heard this, and I think I agree with it. Addiction is the opposite of connection.
Oh yeah, I think I heard that. Is it Gabor Mate? Is it?
Oh God, I love him. He's amazing, right?
I like him.
Yes. Right? So a lot of these ailments, or a lot of these illnesses, or a lot of the suffering is as a result of the trauma of the way we live and how we connect, because it's very hard for us to connect. And if you feel like a loss and nobody understands you, like Carl Jung said, you can be surrounded by people and very lonely, because the loneliness, it's about the people, if you're not understood, you can be incredibly lonely, even though you could be the most popular person.
Yes.
But then if there's nobody that you feel that really understands you. Now, how many men must, if they have been conditioned and told, right, okay, emotions, we don't really do emotions, and we don't really do that, and they're experiencing extreme emotions, and they're around a lot of people who they're not seeing, like that connection, like, and they might not, like, for people, like, I would be very open about going to therapy, but like, not a lot of people are. There's still a stigma. So I just don't think there's enough conversations or enough people able to hold space for people who are really in psychic pain.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Between, because, we all have some form of support network, and, so many people who call into, hotlines like the one I work at, it would be people whose support network isn't necessarily doing them a huge amount of favors at the moment. And that would be through not holding space. But more crucially than anything, the thing I hear over and over again is the invalidation of someone's feelings through, and sometimes that can be direct. Sometimes that can be, you don't have anything to be depressed about, or it can be, sure, what are you sad about, but sometimes it can be more indirect, just go, like stuff like, if you try going for a walk and things like that, which again, technically correct advice, but emotionally a rejection, saying, I don't want to hold space for you, go for a walk. That's kind of, that's the implicit thing that people hear when they get advice, and if there's a show, Ted Lasso is a film that's becoming, or show has become really popular at the minute, and there's even just a line in it where one of the characters is he's talking with two women, and they're talking about a problem, and he says, oh, so you just talk about something and you don't come up with a solution, and then it just ends, like you don't have to do anything, you just say it and hold it, and they go, yeah, and he goes, oh, great, and it's like, I think we could all probably do with that. I think like the video I would often recommend to, because hotlines get a lot of calls from concerned family members and friends who want to do right by their suffering pals, and a video that I would always recommend to them, because it's a good little primer, I think, is Brené Brown on empathy. And Brené Brown is great, obviously, but it's just a simple video about the ways that we respond to other people's problems and how they can be lacking or how they can be improved. But so holding space, essentially, it's one of the most important things in the world, and one of the most important things you can do in a support network, basically.
Can I just say one thing? I think we're gonna probably, I don't know how long we've been.
Me either. But
can I just say about empathy and how we all love it, right? But I'll say, as somebody who's diagnosed autistic and experiences the world very differently to most of the general population, and who a lot of the time I'm told I'm not empathic, whereas people are basically say, which I think I am, and it says in my report I'm very empathic. But what I would say, right, when there's double empathy and there's lots of people with different perspectives telling each other they're not very empathic because they can't understand from the different perspectives, do you see what happens?
Yeah. We can
only ever have empathy when we make an effort to listen to the person. And most importantly, this is the most important ingredient for empathy, I think, believe them.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And like, this is the thing is, I think this is a really enduring myth of the idea of somebody attempting suicide for attention. Isn't that the phrase that people use? I'm not doing it for attention, or this person's doing it for attention. And like, I think what that really is somebody in a support network who's exhausted with a friend, and it's a defense mechanism. It's like, I'm invalidating your feelings because I can't hold this space anymore. Like, and maybe that person has been being a really good support for a long time, and they just need more help. But so I'm not blaming them, but I just think it's I think the idea that anyone is attempting to die by suicide as a form of attention getting, I don't think that, even if it were true, I don't think it would change anything. That's obviously still somebody who needs help.
That's what I think.
Yeah, like it's not fake pain, regardless of how much they actually are going to do it. It's yeah.
Sorry, just because the empathy, it was the argument moved on because of the empathy and the problem people have with empathy only coming from their perspective. But I think it's not like people are like, be kind, right? Yeah, but it's compassion, I think, will always win.
Yeah.
So that kind of compassionate thing, but also going, I can't help you and I feel out of my depth, but I really care. Yes. I'm really worried about you and I want to get, but I'm worried that I'm not skilled enough, and I'm worried that I don't know what to do, and I'm scared, and I love you and I care for you, and we want you to live and get through this, and we're going to get you help. Like, what does it cost to say that?
Nothing. 5 minutes. Yeah. But maybe, I mean, I feel like maybe we're being reductive though, because maybe there's people who are just who have been doing that and are just emotionally exhausted at this point, and yes. it's simply that more support than them is needed. But I would urge you not to rely on that defense mechanism of trying to invalidate their pain and say, well, it's just attention seeking just so that you can sleep at night. It's not helpful.
And also, channel that if you are very, and I really hope I wasn't insensitive by saying that, but I'm saying our society, I think you're right. Like, there's going to be compassion fatigue, there's going to be compassion burnout. I'd say lobby your our health service in Northern Ireland is disgraceful. And the way mental health is treated is disgraceful, and we have a mental health epidemic. So I'd say connect with other people, get people involved. I've seen incredible grassroots activists who've taken that horrific pain and then gone on to do great things in terms of the community and getting people together and organizing, because this is a societal problem. This is not an individual problem. This is an epidemic. So that's what I hope people take away, that it's not their fault. It's actually just a really sick society in many ways that we're living in, that doesn't support the vulnerable.
Yeah, 100%. Because like what Schneiderman said was that that psychic, it comes from a series of unmet needs, and we've all got needs in life. There's the whole Maslow's hierarchy of them, but needs for different kinds of love and affiliation with people, and it's not necessarily any specific needs, but the degree to which they're important to us. So he came up with sort of a list of them. The needs he listed were achievement, so to accomplish something difficult to overcome; affiliation, to adhere to a friend group, to affiliate; aggression, to overcome opposition forcefully, fight, attack; autonomy, to be independent and free; counteraction, to make up for loss by re-striving and getting even; defendants, to vindicate the self against criticism or blame; deference, to admire and support, praise, emulate a superior; dominance, speaks for itself; exhibition; harm avoidance; inviolacy, to protect the self; nurturance, to feed, help, console, protect, nurture another; order, to achieve organization; play, to act for fun; rejection, to exclude other people; sentience, to seek sensuous creature comfort experiences; shame avoidance, to avoid humiliation and embarrassment; succorance, to have one needs gratified, to be loved; understanding, to know answers, to know the hows and whys. I think his language is a little bit odd, isn't it? Because it seems needlessly complex, and sometimes it seems like there's different ways of saying the same thing. But basically, that one or more of those is going to resonate with you and be something that will make you suicidal if deprived from you. There's been some even.
Sorry? Who's that?
That's Schneiderman still.
Can you send me details of that? That's brilliant.
Absolutely, I'll send it right your way. He's done some ratings of psychological needs of eminent individuals. So they did a theoretical needs inventory for the likes of, say, Hitler, Marilyn Monroe, Sigmund Freud. And of course, you see in Adolf Hitler, the highest ones are achievement, aggression, counteraction, and dominance is there too, but it's not as high. Napoleon, 20 for dominance, things like that. Like it's all theoretical, of course, because they never got examined, but it's an interesting way of looking at things.
Very good.
We'll maybe just cover one more thing and then wrap up, shall we? Because I think we've done about an hour nearly. I'm not sure. So two things. First of all, how do you think the pandemic has affected suicide rates?
I don't know. I think they might have. I can't even guess. I know domestic abuse rates went up. With suicide, my feelings would be to say they've gone up, but for some reason I don't. Have they gone up?
You know what? Yeah, I think you listen to your heart, because I think you're actually quite correct. Like the common parlance and the common belief is that they would have gone up, over the last year. But surprisingly, they've gone up marginally, if at all. In some places now, in Canada, it's just come out that suicides fell by 32% in the first year of the pandemic compared with the year before. And I think that's so interesting. Of course, like use of suicide hotlines and use of counselling and support services went up massively. So, this isn't to ignore people's pain and say everyone's been doing fine during the pandemic, but people have been suffering, but not to the point of suicide as much. And I wonder if it maybe has its roots in Thomas Joyner, who's the guy we spoke about at the start. He said that there's like 3 factors that put someone at major risk of suicide. Well, I almost want to make a guess, but it feels too grim a subject to make a guess. Is there any factors that you think would stand out that would make somebody
put you at risk of suicide?
Yeah.
Death of a loved one. Unexpected death of a loved one, or
I think that factors into some of it. Yeah, it's certainly not to be ignored. There is also genetics as well, but no one's quite sure what gene yet.
Right. Okay. And then the thing that's really coming to mind is like I would say I would think, right, in terms of personality disorders and everything, somebody being caught.
Ooh. Yes. Well, that can be quite a shock to the system, can't it?
If you've been used to, so say Jeffrey Epstein or something like that, now I know that's an extreme example, but he was getting away with that for a lot. So sometimes a surprise, people with, now this is I just think in terms of personality disorders, where they're untreated and they're undiagnosed, and they can be a suicide risk because of the shock to the psyche and the shock to the ego if they're caught or if they're seen for the first time. Do you see what I mean?
I see what you mean. Yeah. Yes. To be, because in many ways, that's what we're all afraid of, to be truly seen. And sometimes we can even mistake insults from others as being truly seen. It's like, oh, they see me for who I am, a piece of shit. And
you're celebrated for being a piece of shit, and then all of a sudden it's turned on its head. It can be quite shocking.
Well, that's true too. Yeah, that's true too. But I should have specified that actually the factors that Joyner listed were all interpersonal. I should have said, because it's interpersonal thing. So I led you on by saying genetics and all, and then but they were. What's sorry?
Do you edit that all out, please?
No, he still made some good points. No, tough. No, it's staying in. It was. So the first one is perceived burdensomeness. And how many clients have you had who've used that phrase? I feel like a burden, or I don't want to be a burden.
Loads, all the time.
And it's a massive commonality. I feel like you could float that reflection with nearly any client. Do you ever feel like a burden to others? And they would all say yes, nearly all of them. So perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness. So that basically, it implies loneliness, or like you were saying earlier, or an attempt to belong to a group that's been thwarted, perhaps. There's some interesting statistics that say that suicide rates go down on the dates of big sporting events, Super Bowl Sundays in America. suicide rates plummet, and the theory is there's an increased social connectedness to the sports team or whatever, which lowers the risk for suicide. So thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness together, creates the desire for suicide. And then the third factor is the capability. So he states it's an acquired capability because it's not something we're born with. It's something that people gain through perhaps self-harm, because self-harm is rarely, if ever, a suicide attempt on its own, but it's a factor in gaining the capability to harm yourself, because that's not something that comes easily to us. And yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is that perhaps this is why suicide rates haven't fallen or haven't risen as high as people expected, that in many ways we are more isolated, but in other ways there is an increased togetherness, over the last year, and people have been, helping each other out more than expected. I mean, I do feel like 2021's been harder for that than 2020. I feel like maybe divisions are opening up a bit wider, and I don't think that's going to reflect well on the rates next year, but we'll see. And I think it's harder to feel like a burden on people when you can feel like you're doing a part of not spreading the virus by staying at home. I don't know. I'm maybe just throwing that one out there. I might be talking out my arse, but
no. But the collective are going through something together, so it's a commonality.
Yes, yeah.
It's a common kind of threat. So let's all work together.
We're very much united in our suffering. It makes sense in a way, because when you think of depression support groups, you think, put a load of depressed people in a room and somehow they get better. How does that work? And
oh god,
it's commonality. It's a social connectedness. It's belonging. It's it's having people who understand you. So Well, I hope that you, listener, feel somewhat more understood today.
Yeah.
Thank you for you.
I think that talking about it, this issue is important because it's so prevalent. It's so many people are affected.
It's a biggie. It's and it's it links into every other mental health issue, because they've all got their relatedness statistically to suicide, and it's rarely favorable. But I'm not going to end on that note. I know we're trying to be more serious because it's a serious topic, but I don't think we want to end too somberly either.
Well, then, can I share how I managed? I went through a really dark period years ago, and can I share how I have a love of life after having a hate of life?
Absolutely.
Or just finding, I find that life was just going to be always hard. And it was always, I remember thinking, when I was postnatal depression, I remember thinking, this is never going to get better. This is as good as it gets. And it's shit. It's so shit.
Yeah.
And then I don't feel like that now. I would say I love life, but I know that's really fucking annoying, excuse my French, for people who fucking hate life, seeing somebody like me with my big fucking happy face.
Well, sure, yeah.
So I want to say
optimism in people.
No, and I was just saying, I wrote a blog on it called "It's Always Darkest Before the Dawn," and about it, and it's not an easy read, to be honest. I remember people going, "Freaking hell," but it was honest, and this quote that I love is L.R. Nost, is it? I've got it framed, and it says, "Life is amazing, and then it's awful." And then it's amazing again. And in between the amazing and the awful, it's ordinary and mundane and routine. Breathe in the amazing, hold on through the awful, and relax and exhale during the ordinary. That's just living. Heartbreaking, soul healing, amazing, awful, ordinary life. And it's breathtakingly beautiful.
Lovely. So, thank you for that.
All right.
That's a good one to end on. Thanks for that, Louise.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Therapy Geeks. Find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Deezer, Listen Notes, Stitcher, Podcast Index, and Buzzsprout. Give us a like or a follow or a subscription, whatever your podcast app allows. Thanks for listening.